Hello, students. So one of the overall goals of this course is to discuss some topics about business and project management for the kitchen and bath industry. And so far, we started with a really overview of the industry in general, and then we talked about the industry from the perspective of a business owner or a showroom owner. So today we're going to focus in on a slightly different role and talk about the responsibilities of a designer, a kitchen and bath designer of record. And within that larger topic, we're going to focus in on two specific areas. One is the designer's role within the firm and the project processes based on a couple of typical business models. And the second one is very specifically a relationship between the kitchen or bath designer and the installer. Both of these topics can be found in your kitchen and bath business and project management textbook. We're in, let me see, chapter 13 of your book here. So first, let's talk about that designer's role. The kitchen or bath designer can have varying responsibilities during the project processes, depending on how exactly their business is set up. And so your textbook gives three typical models. The first one is where the designer is responsible for all aspects of the planning process. And this is probably more towards the smaller or boutique firms where they don't have a big back office to help out with this. And so the designer is really hands-on. The second business model is when the designer works with a drafting department and also transfers the project management to a production manager once the installation begins. And the final business model number 3 here, is when a designer works with a design associate during the planning process. So here we kind of have a designer of record and a subordinate role going on in one of the larger firms. Let's go into a little bit more detail. So here's our first model where the designer is responsible for all aspects of the planning process. And in this one, some of those responsibilities are for client contact in the showroom or on the job site, for estimating the job cost, ordering the materials, and monitoring its delivery. If they actually install the product, if that firm does the installation, so the designer would also be the person who, your textbook says, orchestrates the site preparation. All right, so they're managing the job site also, including material delivery and installation. This is kind of a one-person shop setting. Here is our second business model, and that's where the designer is primarily going to work on the client contact and in creating the initial design solutions. So responsibilities there include meeting with the clients, creating the concept solution, and then transferring those sketches and that initial design, the fun part, in my opinion, to a design department. And that could be in-house or it could be outsourced. And then that design department would create the working drawings and do the estimating. They might also be responsible for doing some ordering. Once all of that is complete and it's time to move into production, the project would be handed off to a production manager, and they're going to be the one running the project at that point. Here's our third business model in which the designer works with a design associate during the planning process. And in this one, um, this model really allows the designer of record to step back, focus on design, focus on selling, um, whereas the design associate is going to be the one coordinating a lot of the details. So they might assist the client in some of the smaller decisions and that decision-making process, which can take up quite a bit of time. They would be the one to coordinate estimates, proposals, and job site materials. So the overall idea here is that what exactly a kitchen or bath designer does with their day can, in fact, vary from firm to firm and how they're set up. All right, so there's not a hard and fast rule that always works, but between the different sizes and of firms and the different focus of the different of firms, the roles can vary. For our second topic of the day, we're going to talk about the relationship between the designer and installer, and specifically how to build a good relationship, because that should be your goal. So, here are a couple of tips from your textbook, and the first one is about making each other's lives easier and better and working towards the same goal. So the designer's overall goal might be to make the installer's job easy by creating a comprehensive set of working documents and by working through a lot of the issues ahead of time. And finally, by facilitating perhaps that ordering process and getting the right materials in on the job. The installer's goal, therefore, is to make the design look good. So they have to plan ahead, looking at the design and giving the designer a heads up if they see a problem. And then quality control is going to be a huge, huge issue that the designer, sorry, excuse me, that the installer really needs to cover in order to make that design look good. Here's another tip, include the installer in reviews and discussions. All right, sometimes there's a divide here between white collar and blue collar, and you really need to bridge that divide and work together on your projects. This next tip is for the installers specifically, but it kind of applies to the designer also. Never make negative comments to the client about the designer or work. It applies to the designer also. Don't talk bad about the installer behind their back to the clients. This really just breaks down relationships and proves that you're not part of the same team. In your next tip, you want to make sure to establish a communication system right when you start to work together. Create some processes or some regular meetings, perhaps, or a way for the two of you, the designer and the installer, to have a communication system. And so in many times it's appropriate and you should include the client in those communications. In some other times it's not appropriate and you need to connect directly and then present your solution, for example, to the client. The next tip kind of goes along with that, easy access. You should be able to pick up the phone, text, call, email, and be readily available to one another. And finally, at the end of a job, don't forget to include the installer at the celebration, and they deserve a great deal of credit for the success of your work. And your textbook even mentions share your photos. If you've taken some great job site photos, go ahead and share them with the installer for their use also. So I've included in your Canvas module this week a couple of articles about relationships between this designer and the installer. Or in some cases, they're between the architect and the contractor, or the showroom and the kitchen or bath contractor. All right, this is a similar issue. Um, and in all cases, you want to build that relationship. That's your goal. And so here on the screen are a couple of overall suggestions that I've culled from these articles. So please go ahead and take a look. But in general, a first suggestion is to build teamwork and build trust between the different partners. You are on the same team, you're working on the same project, and you need to work together and not be in an adversarial relationship. The next suggestion is always, and we mentioned this last slide, always open communication. So much communication. More communication is always better in project management, and you need to talk to each other. The third suggestion is about planning ahead and setting expectations between the two of you, or the two parties here that we're discussing, at the beginning of the job. So look ahead, make a plan between you of how this is going to go, and then see if you can follow it. And part of that plan, by the way, involves the last one, which is control. Who's in control? Who's making the decisions? And sometimes it changes based on where you are in the project. One of the articles mentions that at the beginning of the project, the designer should have, like 85% of the control, and the contractor or installer maybe 15%. Maybe they've got some input in some decisions, but they're not the one in general control. After the project is moved on into construction or installation, that control might swap and be 85% the contractor or installer and maybe 15% the designer. So who's in control at any one point might be set up through some of those planning and expectations at the beginning of the project, and is certainly part of building that relationship. All right, everybody, in this video, we touched on a couple of the topics that are specific to a kitchen and bath designer as opposed to the industry in general or the showroom owner or business owner. Thanks, everyone.